He writes, in June 1914, I joined the new Dutch steamer Van der Dijn, chartered to the Atlantic Fruit Company, going to carry bananas from Jamaica to Rotterdam. On the way from Rotterdam to Jamaica, war was declared and we were ordered to Honduras to load cargo for New York. At New York, I was informed that all the company's ships had been chartered to the French government to carry beef from New York to Marseille. I went over on the first ship from New York, which was the Van Hogendorp. At Marseille, the cargo was discharged, and the Dutch government did not like the idea that these ships were continuing in this business since goods were contraband and the charter was canceled. I came home to London. This was about December 1914. After I got home, I got a cable from New York telling me to go to Gothenburg, Sweden. When I arrived there in January 1915, I found a number of Norwegian ships which had been in the fruit trade and were now carrying cotton. I was to take charge of unloading these cargoes. I was there for about 6 weeks. While there, I was arrested as a British spy, but after questioning, was released. I returned to London in March 1915. While I was waiting in London for my next assignment, I decided that I'd better go and join up for the military. I went to the Admiralty and joined up as a lieutenant in the Royal Navy Reserves. I was sent to London to take command of a new Dutch ship that had been taken over by the British government. She was nearing completion in Londonderry. This was the Van Steeram, a sister ship to the ones I had formerly been on. All ships in process of building in England were taken over by the government under the Defence of the Realm Act. When she was ready, I was ordered to Liverpool, where we loaded cargo of beef for Le Havre. This ship was not armed, since they didn't arm merchant ships. Had no incidents on the way to Le Havre, spent 2 or 3 days at Le Havre unloading beef, and then went to Southampton. We loaded there another cargo, then we were running across to France every night with cargo of beef, as much as we could load during the day, and troops. 2 destroyers with me all the time, one on each bow, when we went across with troops. We continued these runs until December 1915. I was en route to Liverpool on an empty ship without convoy, passing the Smalls Lighthouse at the entrance to the Bristol Channel when we sighted 2 submarines, and they put up signals ordering us to stop. We didn't stop, but tried to run away across the channel to the Irish side, doing everything possible to outwit the submarines. Only one of the subs gave chase, and since she had a little more speed than we did, she gradually overtook us. This was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and getting dark. She got within range and started firing her guns. The sub was on the surface all the time. Started shelling us, and she eventually got the range and put the shell over the bridge right alongside where I was standing and blew apart part of the bridge. In the next 2 or 3 shots, she had the rudder. It was now getting quite dark. If it had gotten dark a little sooner, we would have gotten away. When the rudder got out of commission, I had to turn around and look at her. Had to give in then. She was then only 200 to 300 yards astern of us. She got into position to fire a torpedo, and we abandoned ship. The crew were all away, and just as the last boat was getting away, she fired a torpedo, which went right under the boat I was in and hit the ship right in the engine room. There were 2 boys who had been lowering the lifeboats, and they were blown to smithereens. Fortunately, my lifeboat didn't capsize. It was then dark, and so it happened that just about that time a Belgian trawler came along, and we went toward it and got aboard. As we got aboard, the submarine came around to have a look at the ship, Van Steeram, and she fired a couple of shots into her and went away, seeing the ship was doomed. We decided to go on since we had saved all the crew except the 2 boys who were blown up, and we went to Milford Haven. In February 1916, I was sent to Newcastle to look after the refitting of a ship called the Hunsfell, which was originally a German ship that had been captured at the Suez at the beginning of the war. This ship had been at the landing at Gallipoli with troops and had come home to be refitted to carry stores. She was ready to sail, the master took sick, and I had to take her out. We were ordered to Manchester, loaded stores in Manchester for Alexandria, and in order to take her up the canal, I had to cut the mast down, and therefore we had no aerial wireless when we left. This was about June 1916. Got out to Alexandria safely, discharged cargo, were sent there to Marseille, had a 6-inch gun on this ship, loaded stores for Salonika. After delivering my cargo at Alexandria, I was assigned to various duties in the Mediterranean, paying several visits to the south coast of France and north coast of Africa. I was attacked by submarines twice during my voyages between France and Salonika, but I got away on both occasions. Once I was attacked off North Africa coast, and the other time off Plana Island in the Gulf of Lion. On both occasions, I got away under cover of darkness. On October 2nd, 1916, I was on the voyage from St. Louis de Rhone to Salonika when I was torpedoed without warning in the Aegean Sea off the island of Skyros. The ship sank in 20 minutes. We left the ship just before she sank and found after leaving that the mate had been left behind. He appeared just as the ship was going down, stem first, and he jumped into the water and was saved by holding onto a grating. After the ship went down, the submarine came alongside the boats and called for the captain. As I had my uniform on, I was compelled to submit, especially as the officers of the submarine drew their revolvers and commenced to fire across the bows of the boat in which I was. I went on board the submarine, and she immediately submerged as there was a vessel which proved to be a British destroyer coming towards us. The submarine proved to be the U-46, a small vessel which was 8 days from Pula in the Adriatic and was bound for the Black Sea. As word was quickly flashed to the naval base in Maduros that a submarine was in the vicinity, a number of patrol boats were ordered out to look for the submarine. The U-boat had a very small radius underwater, having only storage capacity for about 35 hours for her electric motors. She came up at about 10 p.m. the next night, October 3rd, but had to submerge almost immediately on account of a number of patrol boats being sighted. She came up again during the night, but had to submerge again in a few hours without having charged her batteries sufficiently. The U-boat came up in the Gulf of Flandria, a long, narrow bay at the head of the Aegean Sea where she was apparently trapped. The crew of the U-boat consisted of 18 men, 4 officers including the commander, and 14 seamen. All of the officers could speak English. The accommodations were very limited. There were only 2 berths for the officers, and when one was on duty, the other turned into his berth. The seamen had no definite place to sleep and slung their hammocks anywhere a place could be found. I slept on top of the electric storage batteries in the forward end of the boat and had to turn out whenever one of the seamen wanted my place or the batteries were being charged. There was very little food on the boat, she having been at sea so long, and I was given a small bowl of noodle soup and a piece of black bread each day. I was on board 10 days, and this ration was cut down after 8 days. Until on arrival, we had nothing on board except a few cans of sardines. On the 11th day, after many narrow escapes when attempting to charge our batteries at night, they decided to try and break out of the Gulf, and they were successful in coming up about midnight in the Gulf of Salonika. When we broke the surface, a large French hospital ship was seen close to. This vessel was completely lighted up with a large red cross on each side and forward. The U-boat promptly submerged, and the commander called me into the control room to look through the periscope at the ship he was going to sink. It having recently been given out that the Germans would sink hospital ships on site because they were carrying munitions. This ship could not be engaged in any illegal traffic because she was outward bound from Salonika. This I explained to the commander and also told him that I would report the matter if I ever got back to England. He flew into a rage when I told him this and ordered me back to where I came from. However, he did not torpedo the ship, although the crew was at quarters ready, and he allowed her to proceed without molestation. At about this time, my wife was notified by the British Admiralty that the submarine had been destroyed and me with her. The next night, the U-boat sneaked under the lee of the island of Imrose and reached a rendezvous on the Gallipoli Peninsula, where a German officer came on board to pilot us through the minefields at the entrance of the Dardanelles. After getting underway and passing through the minefields at the entrance, we continued on the surface to Constantinople. During all this time, I was allowed on deck, and it was pleasant relief to breathe fresh air again after being cooped up on the submarine and not allowed on deck during the short periods that she was on the surface for 9 days. We arrived at Constantinople on October the 12th, and I was put on board a German depot ship anchored in the Golden Horn. This ship was named General and was a German East Africa liner and formerly traded between Hamburg and South Africa. It must be remembered that during the last war, that Germany was an ally of Turkey. The officer in charge of this ship was a commander in the German Navy. We became very friendly, and he told me his history. He was born in England of an English father and a German mother. His father died when he was very young, and his mother took him to Germany, where he was brought up as a German and eventually joined the German Navy. I was assigned a cabin, given fairly good food, and allowed on deck during most of the day. Although I was under guard all the time, the guards did not make themselves very obtrusive. The commander told me that the commander of the U-boat had made his report to Berlin, and I would have to remain on board until they decided what to do with me. The commander of the depot ship, whose name I can't remember, was very kind to me and told me every day what had developed. After waiting 2 weeks, they ordered me to be sent to Berlin, and the next morning I was put on a train with a guard of 4 sailors and an officer. I did not have any additional clothes except what I wore, and the journey to Berlin was 5 days. He then goes on describing a long train trip up to Berlin. When I got to Berlin, I was marched through the streets to a place called Blankenberg, where I was placed in solitary confinement under heavy guard. This building had been used as a military academy, but was now used for some other military purpose. Here my troubles started. After being in confinement 2 days, I was taken to a place where I was questioned in English by some naval officers about the incident that happened on the submarine, and also about a pamphlet I was supposed to have received before leaving France about attacking a submarine on sight. The naval officers were not satisfied with my replies or something, and sent me back to prison for another day. The next day I was taken before a lot of naval officers who questioned me again, but apparently without getting what they wanted. The next morning a military guard came to take me away where I did not know. After traveling for some hours, I found myself at Mainz in a fortress. Here I was again placed in solitary confinement. Next morning I was taken before a military commission, but as neither the officers composing the commission or myself spoke the same language, we did not get very far, even through interpreters. I learned afterwards that their objective was to get me to admit that I had received instructions from the British government to fire on a U-boat on sight, in which case they would have shot me as a commander of a non-naval vessel. Fortunately for me, I did not admit anything, and they decided to inter me as a prisoner of war. He then continues to describe a route to his eventual POW camp for British officers, including descriptions of various schemes and attempts at escape. A lot of these stories are reminiscent of the 1960s sitcom Hogan's Heroes, with lots of mistakes by the German guards and a cleverness, naturally, of the British officers to outwit them. Early in 1970, we received orders to move, and 750 British officers were entrained to an unknown destination. We arrived at a small village near to the camp to which we were going. The camp was at Augustabad in Mecklenburg. The camp was an abandoned Jura hotel and was a very beautiful situation on the shores of a lake. This was the best camp I was in during my years in Germany. It was entirely given over to the British, and during the 9 months I was there, I really had a very good time. The food was bad, consisting of cabbage soup and black bread, but we received parcels from neutral countries and never had occasion to eat the German food. The officers of the camp were very lenient, the senior officer being an old Graf, a count, who had lived in England for many years and spoke English perfectly. His assistant was a nephew of the Kaiser, who was also very friendly towards the English. The camp was lighted by large arc lamps at nighttime, and the guards patrolled outside the stockade on the other side of the road which ran around the camp. There was a large dining room with a glass-enclosed bar or canteen in which one sentry was supposed to watch during meal hours. We were allowed to have private theatricals, of which we had one almost every week, there being many actors among the prisoners. We were also allowed to go out of the camp twice per week and stroll in the woods which surrounded the camp and go bathing in the lake. The sentry who went with us was very lax, and when out we didn't see him for hours at a time. There was no stated hour for retiring, but we had to be indoors at sundown. This kind of life soon got monotonous, and we started devising means of escape. The tradesmen were allowed to come into the camp, and we were allowed to buy almost anything. We had several civil engineers in the camp, and they devised a plan to dig a tunnel out of the camp where there was a large bureau in the dining room with a large empty basement underneath. It was planned to cut a hole in the floor of the dining room inside the bureau to get down to the basement and dig the tunnel from there. 4 men worked at a time, and we had a man stationed at a piano who played a certain tune when the guard was out looking and the men came up through the bureau. This does sound like a script for Hogan's Heroes. During the whole operation, which took almost 3 months, the Germans did not find how we entered the basement. We had plenty of tools which we had brought from the tradesmen, even to shovels and crowbars. The men worked in hour-long shifts which corresponded with meal hours. When the tunnel was half finished, the air got so bad that the men could not continue. To rectify this, we asked permission to build some rabbit hutches on the grounds, which we knew would be in the same line as the tunnel. These were built, and we punched holes up from the tunnel. We were fortunate that 3 of them came up in the hutches, while others came up in the open, and we built additional hutches over them. Another came up in the guardhouse, which was outside the blockade, but when the men working heard the bar on the wood floor, they suspected something was wrong and stopped. The Germans never found out what this knocking was about, although they heard it. The tunnel was completed, but it wasn't broken through until 3 days later, when 24 prisoners, including myself and 3 naval officers, made our escape. All the other officers were captured within 48 hours and brought back. Our party of 4 had decided beforehand to make our way to the Baltic coast, 47 miles away to the seaport. We reached the coast traveling only at night and hiding in the daytime. We had some difficulty in finding a boat, but eventually found one that was not chained. We had brought a sail with us that we had made in the camp. The cloth was bought from the tradesman. It was fortunate that we took this precaution because the boat we found had neither sails nor oars in it. We set sail to the island Bornholm at dawn. This is a Danish island, and we thought if we could get there, we would be free. Instead of that, just before dawn, we saw a patrol boat coming towards us. There turned out to be a German patrol watching a minefield which we were right over. The Germans told us that we had no business there. We were landed back in Germany, and after being interrogated for several days, we were sent back to the camp at Augustabad. When we arrived back at the camp, we found everything changed. Our fellow escapees had returned to camp some days before, and we were the last to arrive. They had many stories to tell of their adventures. One had been trailed by dogs and captured when walking on the roads at night, and some had even been captured when lying in fields during the daytime. On the 11th of November, 1918, all restraint was thrown to the winds. We were allowed to go into the town and do whatever we liked. On December 1st, a Dutch train came for us and took us to Denmark, where we spent several days in a hospital and finally took a ship back to England. I arrived home at Wallasey, Cheshire, on the 19th of December, 1918, 2.5 years after I left Portsmouth for a 5-month voyage.